What happens when an entire continent is locked away from the rest of the world for 40 million years? In South America, evolution went rogue, birthing 3-meter-tall, axe-beaked nightmares that hunted on 2 legs. But why did these undisputed masters of the food chain suddenly vanish? And what force finally tore their isolated kingdom apart? For eons, this landscape functioned like an evolutionary laboratory. With oceans forming an impenetrable barrier, the typical rules of competition were suspended. In the shadow of massive herbivores, these flightless giants, the Phorusrhacidae, rose to dominate, filling the top predator niches that mammals held everywhere else on Earth. They were not merely scavengers or opportunists. They were apex hunters, optimized by millions of years of anatomical refinement. Their skulls possessed a rigidity rarely seen in birds, designed to focus kinetic energy into a singular downward strike capable of shattering bone. Their legs, slender and built for stamina, allowed them to bridge the gap between forest and open plain. Yet, for all their specialization, their reign was tethered to a fragile geographic stability. We are just beginning to understand how this avian dynasty held a continent in its grip, to uncover why they rose and what catastrophic shift finally doomed them. We must first step back into the lost world of Cenozoic South America, where the climate, the terrain, and the very connection between land masses were about to change forever. This prolonged period of detachment turned the continent into a vast, oceanic vault where evolutionary trajectories diverted from every other terrestrial standard. As the Eocene dawned, the separation from other land masses effectively sealed South America's ecosystems away from the global tide of mammalian evolution. This meant the rules of the food chain were rewritten in real time, where northern ecosystems saw the rise of specialized feline, canine, and high-anodontid predators. South America followed a radically different trajectory. Without the competitive pressure of these mammalian carnivore guilds, the terrestrial void was filled by the descendants of small, ground-dwelling birds that had already secured a foothold. This unique environmental filtering invited an unlikely candidate to take charge, as the continent's mammals were busy specializing in armored defenses or browsing at impossible heights. The environment was ripe for a predator that did not rely on the teeth and claws of the mammalian world. The lineage known as the Phorusrhacidae emerged as a direct consequence of this unique environmental filtering. These birds were caryomorphs, distant kin to the ground-dwelling seriemas that still skitter through the South American brush today. Yet, stripped of mammalian rivals, they underwent a drastic transformation. They were specialized, bipedal carnivores that restructured their entire skeletal frame for a predatory life on the ground. Over millions of years, their wings withered as their hind limbs elongated, turning their bodies into high-precision engines for terrestrial movement. Fossil evidence confirms their presence as early as the Middle Eocene, roughly 43 million years ago, showing that this lineage occupied the apex niche shortly after the vacuum left by the non-avian dinosaurs. Their rise was characterized by a fundamental shift, moving from generalist forest dwellers into the specialized forms that would dominate open ecosystems. Their biology presents a stark evolutionary divergence, where the standard avian blueprint was pressed into the service of an apex hunter. By optimizing their frames for pursuit and incorporating structural changes to the skull that allowed for massive, bone-shattering force, they claimed the top of the food chain. Their dominance as apex predators endured for millions of years, shaping the continent's ecological hierarchy. Precision in hunting required more than brute force. It demanded a total integration of biological form. Beyond the sheer scale of the terror birds, biologists examined the mechanical tension held within their very skeleton. Their success was an intricate balance of skeletal leverage and metabolic efficiency, keeping these massive predators not just as scavengers, but as active, lethal hunters. The fossil record. From the Middle Eocene to the final vestiges in the late Pleistocene, suggests that every evolutionary adaptation was a response to the constant pressure of survival on a continent where resources were hard-won. At the center of this biological puzzle lies the question of how a heavy, flightless, and ultimately ground-bound biped maintained the agility needed to hunt effectively. Their bones tell a story of extreme, specialized evolution, showing how their frames were modified to support high-speed pursuit without shattering under the force of their own weight. To understand the reality of their hunt, one must look at the specific machinery of their locomotion and how the anatomy of their limbs functioned in concert with their massive heads. But the skeletal structure of these birds hints at even more than raw speed and stability. It suggests a refined predatory efficiency that is still being decoded. Just how did their anatomy allow them to translate the energy of a sprint into the singular, decisive power required to secure a kill? The answer lies in the kinetic architecture of the Phorusrhacidae leg. Unlike the sprawling lateral stance of reptilian predators, these birds maintained a vertical, bipedal carriage that minimized lateral energy loss during a chase. Their tibiotarsus was elongated and slender, optimized for high-frequency strides that could eat up distance across a mosaic of scrub and grassland. The ankle hinge functioned with a rigid precision, locking the leg into a pendulum that allowed for sustained, high-speed movement without the exhaustion common to heavier mammalian hunters. This was a refined, lean, and intensely efficient engine for pursuit. Critically, this speed did not require a sacrifice in stability. The center of gravity was kept directly over the hip, and the feet featured a specialized, robust arrangement. The innermost toe carried a sharp, claw-like structure that gripped the substrate. This allowed for sharp, reactive turns at full speed, giving them the ability to track erratic, fleeing prey through dense thickets. Yet, the legs were only the delivery system. The true lethal capacity of the hunter was determined by how it handled the kinetic load at the moment of impact. The legs could close the distance, but they could not execute the kill. That required a radical departure in how the upper anatomy was integrated, shifting the focus from the torso toward a single, heavy, and potentially fragile point of attack. The shift from movement to impact reveals an anatomy designed for absolute control. Unlike raptors that rely on crushing pressure, the skulls of the Phorusrhacidae were built for speed and durability in the strike. These elongated, rigid structures transitioned into a massive hooked beak, often forming a significant portion of the head's total length. This specialized architecture allowed the bird to channel its entire forward momentum into a single, localized point of contact. The bone density of the upper beak, or rhamphotheca, provided the structural integrity required to deliver a heavy blow without fracturing upon impact. Early models often suggested a violent side-to-side thrashing but recent biomechanical testing challenges that assumption. Computational analysis of these massive, hooked beaks has dismantled a long-standing assumption that these predators engaged in lateral, side-to-side shaking to subdue their quarry. Such motion would have likely shattered the specialized, thin-walled construction of a terror bird's skull. Instead, biomechanical modeling indicates a brutal, singular efficiency. The Phorusrhacidae skull acted as a rigid, reinforced pile driver by locking the jaw and neck into a stabilized posture. The bird could deliver immense vertical force, concentrating the impact into a precise, downward-directed strike. This kinetic energy was intended to fracture bone and crush tissue instantly, turning the beak into a tool for localized trauma rather than a gripping device for tearing. The architecture of the Rhamphotheca, the horny sheath covering the beak, shows specific adaptations to withstand these intense, compressive stresses while protecting the delicate internal structures of the skull. This specialization points to a hunter that dominated through precise, high-impact force, a power that relied entirely on how the bird positioned itself in the final milliseconds before contact. The structural foundation of these birds was supported by high-performance limb architecture. Their tibiotarsus, the long bone of the lower leg, was significantly elongated, providing the mechanical advantage needed for high-speed terrestrial pursuit across the continent's sweeping plains. Beneath the powerful musculature of their feet, researchers have identified a specialized feature, a sickle-shaped claw on the innermost toe. While it does not mirror the extreme morphology of non-avian dinosaurs, this claw likely provided crucial grip on uneven ground and perhaps allowed them to pin struggling prey during the final moments of a hunt. The entire bipedal system was calibrated to keep their center of gravity in precise alignment with the hip, turning their skeletal frame into a stable, shock-absorbing chassis for the lethal, downward-striking head. Today, the only living branch of the same order that birthed the terror bird dynasty are the Seriemas, 80-centimeter-tall, ground-hunting birds still roaming the South American scrub. Watching a Seriema with its keen eye, cautious stride, and rapid strikes at small reptiles is like witnessing a miniaturized living diagram of the Phorusrhacidae strategy. But the scale difference is violent. Where the Seriema hunts insects and lizards, its ancient ancestors were biomechanically engineered to challenge heavy prey. This divergence was not merely a slow shift in body mass. It was a direct response to the long-term absence of large mammalian carnivores in South America. Without the constant pressure from placental predators that restricted avian roles elsewhere, these birds filled the vacuum. They refined their skeletal leverage and vertical striking power, transforming from agile ground hunters into massive, lethal specialists. Yet, even as their bodies scaled up to dominate, they remained tethered to their roots in the Russian riverbank. The earliest terror birds did not emerge as masters of the open plains. They evolved within a much more cluttered, complex world, moving through the dense, shifting mosaics of ancient forests and riparian zones. Their earliest origins lie in the Eocene, deep within the tangled undergrowth of primeval forests. In these closed, humid environments, they existed as stealthier, more opportunistic hunters, stalking under the canopy, where the dense foliage favored shorter-range strikes over sustained open-ground speed. The transition to the apex predator role was not immediate. It was a slow calibration of bone density and skeletal leverage. Moving from opportunistic forest foragers to specialized, dominant carnivores. Yet, as the Middle Miocene approached, the continent's climate began to pull the rug out from under this established order. Increasing aridity across the southern reaches fractured the deep, protective woods, shrinking the forest refuges and unveiling vast exposed expanses of grassland. For a predator built for the shadows and the short, violent strike, the environment shifted from an asset into a massive liability. The Miocene landscape offered no shade from this pressure. As the climate grew drier, the dense, sheltered forests that had sustained the early evolutionary stages of the Phorusrhacidae began to thin, giving way to an expansive, sun-drenched savanna. These vast open plains shifted the fundamental requirements of survival for any terrestrial carnivore. Stalking through cover was no longer enough. The new reality demanded a high-octane engine capable of sustained movement across open horizons. The prey species occupying these grasslands were no longer sedentary browsers of the undergrowth, but fleet-footed mammals capable of covering long distances to avoid the heat of the midday sun. For a hunter built on the biomechanics of the forest floor, the transition to the open grass was a severe, high-stakes filter. The anatomical evidence confirms they adapted. The Phorusrhacidae skeletal structure shifted, favoring a more gracile, cursorial build perfectly synced to the demands of the Miocene plains. Their tibiotarsus, the bone forming the primary segment of the leg, stretched and thinned, optimizing the limb for sustained velocity rather than the shorter, explosive bursts required for life in a dense forest. This shift moved their center of mass forward, aligning the hip and leg in a vertical column that minimized wasted energy with every stride. By thinning the bones while maintaining the structural density of their lower limbs, these birds essentially traded brute forest power for the relentless efficiency of a long-distance pursuit hunter. They were no longer merely ambush predators lurking in the thickets. They became masters of the open savanna, capable of tracking fleet-footed mammalian herbivores across miles of shifting grassland. To see the physical limit of this specialization, look no further than the Patagonia of 15 million years ago. It was here that researchers unearthed Kelenken guillermoi, a predator that redefined the sheer scale of the terror bird lineage. Standing nearly 3 meters tall and weighing well over 200 kilograms, it was not merely a hunter. It was a biological tower of power. The centerpiece of this fossil is a skull measuring 71 centimeters long, a massive, bony structure where the beak alone accounts for nearly 2/3 of that length. This wasn't just a larger version of its ancestors. It was an extreme adaptation that pushed the mechanics of the downward strike to their absolute maximum. The density of that hooked beak, coupled with the sheer leverage provided by such a disproportionate skull, suggests that Kelenken could exert forces far beyond what had been necessary for earlier, smaller forms. While Kelenken stood as the undisputed master of its specific Miocene environment, its existence poses a geographic question. If these giants were so perfectly tuned to the isolated landscapes of the South, were they truly locked behind a curtain of water? Or were they secretly roaming ground we never expected to find them on? The classic narrative of the Phorusrhacidae has always been one of confinement. We have long viewed them as products of an evolutionary cradle, bound by the tectonic walls that kept South America apart from the rest of the world. For decades, the maps of their dominance ended at the shifting, narrow borders of the southern continent. But the evidence now emerging from across the northern boundary is pulling that neat geographic story apart. Paleontologists tracking these birds are discovering fossils in locations that defy the old logic of an isolated, southern-only lineage. A single, distinct fossil found deep in the northern landscape has recently turned this entire understanding on its head, pointing to a range that forced these giants out of their comfort zone and into a much larger, more volatile world. We must now turn our gaze toward a specific desert in Colombia to see what this northern shift meant for their survival. In the arid expanse of the Tatacoa Desert, a solitary fossilized leg bone has shattered the traditional view of a strictly southern reign. Excavated from sediment layers dating back 12 million years to the Middle Miocene, this single remain confirms that these predators were stalking through northern territories long before the land bridges of later eras. This was not a fringe inhabitant clinging to the periphery of a range, but a fully adapted hunter thriving deep in the tropics of what is now Colombia. Analysis of this particular Colombian specimen indicates it could have been even larger than the classic Patagonian giants, perhaps by as much as 20%. It was an apex predator that moved through a landscape far more crowded than the isolated plains of the south. Far from being the sole masters of a quiet island, these terror birds shared their habitat with massive, armored crocodilians and formidable, ground-dwelling reptiles capable of challenging any hunter. They were not merely stalking open grasslands. They were competing within a high-stakes, multi-predator environment that tested their specialized biology to its limits. This level of ecological pressure meant that every advantage, every millimeter of beak length, and every structural alignment of their legs was a requirement for survival. The fossil record reveals they surged far beyond South American borders. The most definitive evidence of this migration appears in the southern United States, specifically within the fossil-rich deposits of Florida and Texas. Here, paleontologists unearthed the remains of Titanus wolleri, a massive Phorusrhacid that stands as a stark contradiction to the image of a strictly isolated southern-bound dynasty. Standing between 1.5 to 2 meters tall and weighing upwards of 300 kilograms, Titanus was a formidable apex predator by any measure. Its presence in North America confirms that these avian hunters were not merely trapped on their home continent by rising seas or shifting tectonic plates. Instead, they pushed northward, establishing a predatory foothold in foreign ecosystems, millions of years before the land bridges became permanent. The discovery of Titanus forces a complete recalibration of their timeline. It suggests that their capacity for movement and expansion was far more aggressive than early theories of total isolation ever accounted for. Researchers were initially baffled by the fossil remains, leading to a long-running, if ultimately flawed, theory that Titanus possessed a uniquely terrifying weapon. A pair of flexible, grasping forelimbs. Early reconstructions famously depicted these birds with long, hook-clawed fingers capable of snatching and holding prey. This image fit the narrative of a monstrous, almost alien predator arriving from the south. Yet, when specialists performed more rigorous comparative anatomy, the illusion crumbled. Subsequent analysis confirmed that Titanus, like every other Phorusrhacid, carried only tiny vestigial wings tucked against its sides. It was never a winged grappler. Instead, it was restricted to the same mechanics as its ancestors, a reliance on high-speed terrestrial pursuit and the crushing, vertical, bone-shattering force of a heavy, hooked beak. This realization forced a major pivot in how experts understood the transition of these birds into North America. The most critical clue lies in the chronology of these northward movements. Titanus does not simply signal that terror birds crossed only once a permanent land bridge locked into place. Instead, the evidence implies a history of earlier, intermittent dispersal, a series of fleeting windows before the major pulse of continental exchange. This suggests these predators may have utilized temporary island chains or coastal corridors, moving long before the Isthmus of Panama became a solid, continuous structure. The presence of such large, specialized birds in North American strata points toward a deeper, more fragmented reality of faunal migration. If they were capable of crossing shifting, partially aquatic barriers during these pre-main phase intervals, it complicates the conventional narrative of isolated southern empires. The birds were not passive inhabitants of a static, lonely island. They were active, potentially mobile components of a changing, semi-permeable system. This early incursion revealed that the wall between the two Americas was never as absolute as once thought. A truth that fundamentally shifts how we view the final, inevitable collapse of their long-held dominance. This vulnerability was, in hindsight, a warning of what happens when a protected ecosystem finally runs out of time. These early fractured migrations across a semi-permeable landscape were merely the prelude to a much larger geological realignment. For millions of years, the deep ocean barriers had been the primary filter of evolutionary selection, keeping the terror birds at the helm of their own world. But the tectonic forces beneath the Caribbean were already in motion, gradually closing the gap between the northern and southern plates. The oceanic chasm that shielded the continent for most of the Cenozoic was slowly narrowing, pushed by the constant, grinding pressure of Earth's crust. It was an inevitable slow-motion convergence that would eventually delete the very isolation that made this avian dynasty possible. The final barrier was not a permanent wall of default, but a shifting, porous boundary that was destined to fail under the weight of tectonic change. The stage was being set for a final, catastrophic collision of worlds, as the ground itself rose to stitch together two long-severed Americas and trigger the final, irreversible transition. Roughly 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama locked into place, creating a dry land bridge where only deep water currents had churned for 60 million years. This was more than a geological event. It was the abrupt termination of an isolated evolutionary timeline. For the terror birds, this meant the sudden, permanent collapse of their natural sanctuary. As the physical gateway between North and South America solidified, the continent was no longer a private laboratory. This monumental closure triggered the Great American Biotic Interchange, a biological collision on a continental scale. For millions of years, the northern and southern plates were distinct kingdoms, their faunas evolving in total ignorance of one another. When the isthmus bridged the gap, that protective barrier vanished. North American predators, honed in a highly competitive, fast-paced environment, moved south with a sudden, relentless momentum. They didn't arrive as a trickle. They flooded the landscape. The newcomers were not random stragglers. They were specialized, highly efficient mammalian hunters, including saber-toothed cats and bear-like procyonids. These predators possessed sensory systems and social strategies honed in the intense competitive furnace of the northern continents. They entered an environment where the native fauna had, for millions of years, evolved in relative solitude. The terror birds, having occupied the apex of the southern food chain for epochs, now faced competitors that were faster, more diverse, and physically equipped to challenge their hold on the landscape. This was no longer an island ecosystem where one dynasty could comfortably monopolize the hunt. As these northern carnivores carved out their own niches, the sheer pressure on resources intensified. Prey animals, once accustomed to the specific, predictable hunting patterns of a flightless bird, were suddenly forced to contend with an entirely different set of threats: stealth, ambush, and cooperative pack tactics that were alien to their native habitat. The stability of the landscape, which had allowed the terror birds to refine their anatomy into the ultimate downward-striking machine, began to erode. Every interaction was a stress test for an evolutionary path that had not been built for this level of conflict. The struggle for survival was not a sudden clash of titans. It was a slow-motion unraveling of a continent's biological exclusivity. The arrival of North American placental carnivores, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and short-faced bears introduced strategies into a theater where the Phorusrhacidae had long dictated the terms. These mammalian invaders utilized different social structures and hunting tactics previously absent from the South American landscape. They were not merely fighting the terror birds. They were outcompeting them for a shrinking pool of herbivorous prey. Even as cooling climates transformed the terrain, this competition intensified as the land bridge solidified and the vegetation mosaic fragmented. The terror birds, with their highly specialized cursorial skeletons, had optimized their bodies for high-speed pursuit in stable, predictable environments. When the new mammalian guilds introduced more adaptive, generalist hunting techniques, the margin of error for such specialized apex predators vanished. They were constrained by their own evolutionary refinement. They had reached an anatomical pinnacle that offered little flexibility as their hunting niches began to contract. Their decline arrived long before the first stone tool-wielding hominids appeared in South America. For decades, the narrative favored an extinction triggered by the arrival of humans, yet the fossil record now demands a complete rewrite of that timeline. Improved radiocarbon and stratigraphic dating prove the largest terror birds vanished well over 1.5 million years before humanity set foot on the continent. Their disappearance was not a singular, tragic event at the hands of a new hunter, but the quiet, grinding result of an ecological squeeze. As the Isthmus of Panama locked into place, the flood of northern placental carnivores, including felids, canids, and ursids, introduced new, highly adaptable predatory strategies. These mammals possessed different metabolic needs and social hunting structures that began to outcompete the Phorusrhacidae model. It was an involuntary shift. As the competitive pressure intensified, the very specialized anatomy that once made them masters of the landscape turned into an evolutionary trap. The window was closing on the era of the giant avian predator. Their reign was not ended by a sudden catastrophe, but by the relentless, cumulative pressure of a continent that was rapidly becoming too small for their singular way of life. The legacy of these birds persists in the fragmented fossil record of the late Pleistocene. Their ultimate demise marks the point where the South American ecosystem shifted from a closed laboratory to an open, competitive theater. Paleontological data confirms that the largest Phorusrhacids vanished well over 1 million years before the arrival of early human hunters, settling the debate over whether we bear responsibility for their extinction. Instead, the final species, such as the smaller, more resilient forms, could not maintain their ecological foothold against the influx of mammalian carnivores like smilodons and modern canids. These northern arrivals, armed with different predatory tools and greater metabolic plasticity, eroded the terror bird's dominion piece by piece. Their extinction was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow retreat into the shadows of a changing landscape. Today, the only remnants of this dynasty are the scattered tibiotarsus bones and beak fragments tucked away in museum drawers. The final silent witnesses to a time when giant, flightless birds were the undisputed masters of a lonely continent. These fossils are the only keys we have to a closed world. Beyond the museum cabinets, researchers are now using CT scans to peer inside the craniums of these giants, mapping the internal structure of the brain and the complex inner ear. What they have found contradicts the old image of a mindless, aggressive creature. The endocasts reveal a surprisingly well-developed sense of balance and a visual processing area built for high-speed tracking across shifting terrain. These birds were not clumsy brawlers. They were precision instruments of their environment. By analyzing the fossilized inner ear canals, which govern equilibrium, scientists can now calculate the exact speed at which these predators likely navigated their native savanna. This data provides a rare window into their sensory world, moving them from static bones to living, breathing apex predators. It confirms that their anatomy was not a product of chance, but a fine-tuned response to a continent that demanded speed, vertical power, and unwavering focus. The terror birds succeeded because they mirrored the very logic of the South American wilderness. They were as fast, as unpredictable, and as perfectly adapted as the land that built them. Their story remains a rare, isolated chapter in the deep history of life on Earth, reminding us that nature will always find a way to fill an empty niche, even if it has to reinvent the rules of survival to do it.